Today on SUNUP. The latest drought maps tell the story. With extended dry conditions, we raise the question, why don't we have a repeat of the Dust Bowl days? Plus, before you ride off your receding pond, you may want to take a closer look at the beneficial plants. And, are cattle in danger if they graze near power lines? All this and much more, next on SUNUP.
Hello everyone and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lundell Stout. We join you today from the Alumni Center on the OSU campus for the annual Rural Economic Outlook Conference, where the focus is on the future of agriculture. Producers, bankers, ag leaders, and educators, all among the crowd at the 2012 Rural Economic Outlook Conference, a day-long event looking at projected trends for the year ahead.
The environment is always a concern in terms of the regulations there. So we have a speaker from EPA, Farm Bill, because of the recent election and because of the failure thus far to pass it, is of urgent concern to producers who are trying to make decisions. So globalization, as was discussed by one of our keynote speakers, is a continuing opportunity for people in agriculture and provides a lot of prospects for bright futures. And so it's always interesting to hear perspectives from people who are very involved at the international level about trade and globalization.
Involvement in policy and the importance of it.
One of those people, Richard Crowder, teaches international trade at Virginia Tech. He is more optimistic about U.S. agriculture than ever before in his nearly 40-year career.
We've got to keep pushing technology. We've got to keep pushing the hiring of what we call amazing people so that the management stays well. And just keep our competitive lead that we have. And a lot of that's due to management. A lot of it's due to climate and land and other stuff. But management is the key thing.
Pessimistic, so I put to $5 because...
Familiar OSU Extension faces also gave their projections on crop markets, the cattle industry, cropland values, and the farm transition process. But the overarching theme of the day, the status of the economy.
Now in Oklahoma, we've been doing much better than the nation for the last 2.5, 3 years, and continue to. The only state clearly growing faster than us right now is North Dakota. Much smaller state, obviously driven by oil and gas. We have seen some slowing in Oklahoma the last couple of months related to energy. The biggest reason for that, I think, is that natural gas liquids prices have come down. Natural gas prices remain low, but thankfully oil prices remain high. And we have a couple of fields recently rediscovered in Oklahoma that are heavy producing oil and gas. Another factor in Oklahoma recently has been the drought, as throughout most of our region, has boosted crop prices. And if crops are insured, actually farm incomes could rise. But livestock producers, in particular cattle producers, are being squeezed, and I think break-even costs for cattle are going to be not attainable for at least another year or so. So that's going to put a damper on rural activity in some parts of the state.
More from the conference a little later in the show.
Hi, I'm Al Sutherland with your Mesonet weather report. Rain swept across portions of Oklahoma last weekend. It was a plus that it rained over much of the state. The downside was how little rain fell. We just aren't getting the rain farmers and ranchers need. On a Mesonet rainfall map, the areas colored green had 3/4 of an inch or more, but the highest recorded rainfall was only 1 24/100 inches at Copan near Bartlesville. The blue-colored areas were typically closer to a 1/2 inch, and the white area in the Panhandle shows that no rain fell west of Buffalo. That rain had an impact on shallow soil moisture, as we can see on a fractional water index map for the 2-inch depth from early this week. But checking deeper at 24 inches, the fractional water index values for much of the state are closer to 0. It's the lack of deeper moisture and light rainfall events that concerns farmers and ranchers as they look ahead. Gary, what's your perspective on the rain from last weekend?
I'm afraid for most of the state, the amounts just weren't quite enough to put a dent in the drought. It certainly helped, of course. We did see some improvements from down in central Oklahoma through Grady County, all the way up through northeastern Oklahoma to around Miami. So there was some improvements, but unfortunately we also saw some advancing drought in west central Oklahoma and southwestern Oklahoma, and also the Panhandle, where that D4 gained some ground. As we look back at our October-November periods over the last 3 years, each one of them has been pretty important in this drought. Back in the 2010 October-November version, we had a statewide average of about 3.6 inches of rain. That was about 2.5 inches below normal, and the 35th driest October-November on record, dating back to 1895. You can see on this percent of normal rainfall map is pretty wet in the west and fairly dry in the east. The 2011 version looks so awesome right now. I wish we had it. We had a statewide average of 7.3 inches over that period, about an inch above normal. But that ended up being the 26th wettest on record, dating back to 1895. And you can see on the percent of normal rainfall map, there were a few dry spots, but it was mostly above normal rainfall. And again, that's when our relief last year really got started and lasted through about March or April. Now we look at this year's version, even though it only goes through the 14th, we've had an average of about 1.6 inches of rain from October 1st till now. Now that's less than half of what we had in 2011 when the drought got its start. And this one's more than 3 inches below normal. And that ends up being about the 11th driest October 1st through November 14th on record. And if we don't get some rainfall soon, it's going to be one of the driest October through November periods on record as well. Unfortunately, November looks mostly dry as we look from this point forward. Now hopefully by the time you're seeing this, another storm will have popped up on the horizon. At any rate, we do need the rainfall. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
Larry Sanders, our ag policy specialist, joins us now. And Larry, let's start talking some politics. The election is over. The big question, what happens next?
Yeah, what are we all going to do with our spare time?
Exactly.
It's amazing. You know, after all that's happened, with all the money that's been spent, all the back and forth in the debates and the rancor, the landscape has really very little changed. There's a little bit more strength in the Democrats on the Senate side, a little bit more Democratic strength in the House, but the Republicans are still very strongly in control. And of course, Obama back in, and you can argue if you look at the electoral votes whether he had a mandate versus the popular vote, which is relatively close. But landscape hasn't changed very much. But what they have to do is changing as we speak, and we've got some big decisions ahead, and the sooner we make those, I think the better for the country and the world.
There's a lot of talk, of course, post-election. Do you think there will be more bipartisanship now that we're in the president's second term?
I think there'll be early attempts at it, but I think very quickly the House is probably going to posture itself to see whether or not they still have the ability to flex their muscle. But we are moving toward this cliff in January, the fiscal cliff. And the farm bill, whether we extend it or have a new one before then, is going to play into that very compelling drama as we move forward.
And what are some of the things that we're going to see with the farm bill in the next few weeks?
Well, we're probably going to see an extension. We've only got about 2 to 4 weeks of working days in Congress that are left in this year because of all the breaks that they have yet to take and the administrative duties that they have. But an extension is almost certain to give them the breathing room to do what has to be done and to give the market certainty for the coming year. But they're very quickly going to begin to decide whether or not they're going to move toward what the Senate has proposed as a farm bill and what the House Ag Committee has proposed as a farm bill. Two very good bills. The President has said, I don't care very much. Let's just get one of them done and get it out of the way. So he's sort of postured himself to stay out of the debate until it gets to conference. So if and when they go to conference, which could be before the end of the year, the conference then will begin the tough decisions of saying, do we want more or less in food stamps, the SNAP programs, how big are the cuts that we are going to have to farmers with commodity program cuts, and are we ready to have this major rewrite to go to risk management programs? And I think even if we get it to conference, even if the House decides to vote and we get something to conference, there won't be time to do it by the end of the year. We'll move into next year, and it could play into the difficulties of going off that fiscal cliff.
Okay. Continue to watch that. And finally, just a quick word on the economy. It's still on everybody's minds.
Sure, and even though the markets have been maybe having an adverse reaction this week, I think that's settling down very quickly, because what they've got now is some degree of certainty. They know who is going to be in the White House. They know what the House and Senate look like. So markets have been very unstable over the past year because of this question of who's going to do what, and we know that now. We know who the players are, and because they're very similar to the players we've had the last 4 years, they pretty much know how they're going to shape the debate at the negotiating table. And so domestically, I think we're going to see more stability. The world market is beginning to be in a very big panic, because they think if we actually go off this financial cliff, that we may stay there and it may harm their economies, like in Europe and China, at a time when they can't afford it. I think even if we go off the fiscal cliff, it won't last very long, and we'll begin to do what has to be done. So they may realize that after a time, but right now there's more uncertainty out in the world than there is here in the U.S.
Okay. Larry Sanders, we appreciate your time as always, and
Thank you.
We'll see you again soon.
Hi, welcome to Shop Stop. Today we want to spend a little bit of time talking about grinding and catching some of the chips and the small pieces that are coming off of that.
If you've ever used a die grinder like this with the carbide ends on it, why, it throws a lot of sharp pieces off the material you're taking off. And here's a little tip on how to catch those.
You can use a little bit of duct tape wrapped around it, and so the duct tape will then catch it. But another way is you want to make sure that your die stays clean all of the time.
That's right. And the way you want to do that is you can, if you're using one of these and you're using it on like a non-ferrous, it'll plug up with aluminum, whatever it might be, and then you want to, if you can dip that in a little bit of wax like that before you operate it, and it'll help keep the chips from collecting up in here and plugging up your tool.
And then the duct tape will catch those that are flying off.
So, a little demonstration here. You can see right there that it's caught those little pieces of metal from what I've just shaved off of this extrusion.
So there's a little tip on die grinding and keeping your work area clean. We'll see you next week on Shop Stop.
Kim Anderson, our grain marketing specialist, joins us now. And Kim, you and I have talked for weeks about this sideways pattern with prices, and you got some feedback from your brother in Muskogee County. What did he tell you?
Well, he asked me if I was going to talk about the sideways pattern this next Saturday on SUNUP, and that if I was, then he was just going to turn it on in time to get Glenn Selk and find out what to do with his cows. What Chester doesn't realize is that there's a 92-cent spread in that sideways pattern, that we have uptrends and downtrends in that, and that shows the volatility and the uncertainty of our market today.
Okay, and no, there's no sibling rivalry there or anything, is there?
None at all.
None at all. Okay, you mentioned the uncertainty. There's some levels of that. Let's kind of talk about those prices first.
Well, if you look back over, say, the last 5 years, going back to, say, June 1 of 07, You can look at February the 27th of 2008. The Oklahoma cash prices were $12.58 a bushel. You get up to June the 9th of 2010, less than 2 years later, we're down to $3.08. That's a $9.50 range in a 2-year period. And right now, we've got prices up. We've been talking about this sideways pattern running from $8 to around $8.60.
Okay. Another level of uncertainty, of course, the economy, both U.S. and the world picture.
Right, the economy's playing a big picture. You've got the uncertainty, and we haven't talked about it a while, of what's going over in the European Union, Greece, Spain, Portugal, those areas that are having economic problems. And then you've got the cliff. They're talking about the economic cliff here in the United States that can happen after the first year. Tremendous amount of uncertainty in the world's economy and the U.S. economy.
The election's over, and of course that plays into even more uncertainty in the political picture and policy.
Yeah, there's, we can talk about the farm bill, and that, we don't have a farm bill right now. We passed it. The Senate has their bill. The House has their bill. We don't know what's going to come out of that. But you've also got the uncertainty relative to ethanol and relative to the fuels and the corn and how that's going to spin off on the wheat.
With all this in mind, what are you telling producers right now?
I think producers just need to ignore the uncertainty and concentrate on producing a high-quality crop that the consumer will buy.
Okay, very good. And we appreciate Chester weighing in this week as well. Kim, we'll see you next week.
Over the last 39 years that I've been working here in Oklahoma in the Extension Service and visiting with cow-calf producers all over the state, about 4 different times I've had the question about if there's any impact due to high voltage direct current power lines that are going through the pastures where the cattle are grazing. Does that have any impact at all on the reproductive or the growing capability or the survival of those cattle? Well, there has been research done, not here in Oklahoma, but in some other states that take a real good look to answer that question. In particular, in Oregon, they actually looked at a cow herd that was grazing in a range situation, pretty similar to what we have right here in Payne County. They compared cattle grazing that would go in and underneath the power lines on occasion to another herd that was very similar, close by, but did not have exposure to the electromagnetic field that might be coming from those power lines. What they found was no difference at all in the performance of the cattle. In fact, the quote that they gave at the end of the research was that there was no statistical significant differences in the growth or reproduction between cattle raised under the line and the control cattle. In even perhaps a more compelling study that was done in another state, looking at a situation where beef cow herd was actually in a confined area to where they had more permanent access to anything that might be involved with the high voltage power line above them. And they were compared then to a control group that was close at hand, close by, but not exposed to the electricity. In that particular study, the outcome was very similar. The folks saying that there was no difference in the frequency of conception, in calving rate, in growth rate, or in survival. So I think that if you're in a situation where you have one of these high voltage power lines going through your place, or you're looking to lease an operation or buy some land that might have one of these high voltage power lines going by, no real reason to have concern about the impact of cattle that might be grazing those pastures near or underneath those power lines. I hope that helps answer the question for those few folks in Oklahoma that are in that situation. And we look forward to visiting with you again next week on SUNUP's Cow-Calf Corner.
We've been talking about the future of agriculture today, and now we want to take a look back at the past. Here's SUNUP's Dave Deacon.
Oklahoma is dry. Since November of 2010, the state has been under some type of drought designation, and the signs don't point to much relief in the near future.
The forecast had shown that we were going to have an El Nino, which would tend to help us out. It causes us to, here in the southern plains, to have a little bit of a wetter and cooler October through March period. But unfortunately, that El Nino didn't ever materialize.
With a dry forecast, preparations for a third year of drought, and the recent dust storms that blew across the Great Plains, Oklahomans may be asking if we could return to one of our state's actual darkest times. Historian Dayton Duncan worked on a film called The Dust Bowl that will air on OETA on Sunday night and Monday night. Dayton says that the years before the soil blew, the area was much different even than it is now.
It was a beautiful grassland at one point, and for a variety of reasons, in the early teens and the 20s, the equivalent of the state of Ohio got changed, suddenly from a grassland to to a cash crop land. And some of that land should never have been turned in the first place.
Back then, it really was promoted as kind of, the deeper you could till, the better your yields were going to be. You wanted to bury that residue.
The downside is they really didn't know the ramifications of what would happen if they plowed up the high plains and portions of the southern plains with no respect to soil types and erosivity of those soil types.
As one of the cattlemen said, when he saw all the plowing going, he was talking to his son, he said, "Look at it, it's wrong side up." That was sort of ignoring why was this a grassland in which the grasses were generally shorter than taller. It's because every once in a while on the Great Plains you're going to have a drought, and every once in a while that drought's going to be really hard, and every once in a while it's going to be really hard and really long.
You can really liken it to what we've seen the last couple of years, where we had the severe drought of 2010 starting in about October, lasted through about October 2011, and then we saw a great deal of relief through the winter, and then a return to drought as we got into late spring. That's the type of situation we saw back in the Dust Bowl.
And it happened in the 1930s. Rain stopped, the air was hot, and started to blow like it usually does around here. The soils that producers had turned had been planted with hopes of raising another crop, but instead, clouds of dust grew from the soil and started to move.
Out in the panhandle, you get into these very fine sandy loams and very fine loamy sands. And those very fine sands, those are the ones that can really start blowing very quickly and very readily, because a large sand particle is too heavy to be lifted off the ground. It just rolls. But a very fine sand, it can be moved and it bounces and it just starts bouncing. And that bouncing action will actually dislodge your clays and your silts. And then they start bouncing and then they get lifted up in the air.
So if the droughts of the 1930s and our current one are so similar, why haven't we seen walls of dust sweeping across the Great Plains?
As we got past the Dust Bowl, the 1930s drought, we got into another similar drought in the 1950s, which statistically for the state is probably worse than the Dust Bowl drought, but we didn't see that massive amount of erosion. And again, that's due to those better conservation practices that agriculture learned from the 1930s.
In large part, a lot of our marginal land has been taken out of production, either through CRP or just the realization that, hey, this cropland's not suitable for raising crops.
I work in cropland. Same thing goes for pasture land, trying to better understand how to incorporate resilience against these droughts.
Discovery of nitrogen fertilizer started the mass production of fertilizer, and especially herbicides. I think that kind of transformed the way we thought about managing the land, that we do have, a certain amount, percentage of our acres, 20–30% of our acres in no-till, which try to maintain that residue on the surface year-round. So I think that even though it's pockets here and there, that's really what is holding in certain places, keeps that dirt from blowing.
We're moving forward on some things. No-till's one that's come on in the last 10 years. Now we're looking at cover crops in the fallow period. We're trying to continue to develop our understanding of soil moisture and how different crop rotations influence soil moisture and how we may better take advantage of it. We're learning these things in a drought.
It's going to be hot, and we'll always have a dry year or two, or three. But we don't have to live with a wall of soil from the ground to the sun marching across the prairie like they did back in the 30s. because of the lessons learned by those who plowed all the prairie that they could and those that took a different approach to agriculture.
Well, this is a typical scene in late summer or early autumn in Oklahoma, where we have a natural drawdown of ponds and lakes and reservoirs. And what we often see, depending on the timing of that drawdown, you'll see a lot of native plant response. Here we mostly have cyperus. This is redroot sedge. It's a really important waterfowl plant, produces abundant seed, and when this refloods, hopefully later in the winter, this will be really important for waterfowl. You get a lot of use where they're feeding on these seeds, and also as this plant material starts to break down and decompose, there will be a lot of aquatic invertebrates, basically insects, that the waterfowl can feed on. Now, this wasn't planted, this was in the seed bank, and you get this a lot on moist areas where you have these drawdowns. And if you have a large reservoir or pond on your property that you have control of the water, in other words, you have a water control structure, you can actually create this. You can draw that water down sometime in mid-summer and create mudflat areas where you'll get some regenerating or seed germination. Now, the risky part of this in Oklahoma is often we don't get fall rains, so this might not reflood, so you're taking a chance if you're trying to attract waterfowl. But if it does happen to reflood, you're going to have a lot of waterfowl use on that area for hunting later in the winter.
That does it for us this week. Remember, you can see us anytime online at sunup.okstate.edu. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and safe travels, and we'll see you next time at SUNUP.